All right. Thank you and welcome to our webinar on behalf of Infragard, Louisiana. If you are not an Infragard member, I would highly encourage you to join our chapter. We are nationally recognized. We have over 1,200 members. And also, I would like to thank April Danos and Teresa Jones for putting this webinar together. And I would like to thank Secure Nation for hosting our GoToMeeting website, and also Checkpoint for hosting the speakers. Thanks, Jaron Martin with FBI New Orleans Cyber Squad 6. Thanks, Brian Walterson with Asgard and Robert Williams with Asgard. With that, Teresa and April, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lester. I'm going to go on and introduce Mr. Brian Waltermeyer. He's both a thought leader in the world of IT security and the founder and CEO of Asgard Managed Services. His experience at several New York City hedge funds sparked his foray into the world of IT security because he saw how the world was changing from sharing everything on social media to one of privacy and resiliency. Through his leadership, Asgard became the first managed security provider to license the Vertex secure domain name technology, and has spoken on numerous public engagements about the benefits of his resilient networking technology. Asgard continues to be a leader in security implementations and currently manages the largest network of secure communication networks for the healthcare industry. Today, Brian will educate us on the differences in encrypted peer-to-peer communication technologies. Brian, it's all yours.
Okay. Well, thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Lester. Thank you, April. Thank you, Jaron. And welcome and thank everybody for joining. I appreciate Infragard and our friends at the State of Louisiana Cybersecurity Commission who recommended that we be here to present this extremely valuable information to you all today. We're going to spend about 20 minutes or so reviewing the current state of cyber risks at critical infrastructure organizations, the security modalities currently being utilized by those organizations, and most importantly, what the future of peer-to-peer communications and secure networking looks like in today's ever-changing technology landscape. After I'm done speaking, Jaron will speak for a little bit, and then at the very end, we'll be fielding questions from all the attendees about anything you might have questions about technology, presentation, or otherwise. We do have a technical engineer, a security engineer from Asgard on to answer more of those types of questions. So feel free to post those in the chat as we're going through. And Teresa, our moderator, will be putting those up to be answered at the end. So without further ado, we'll go to the first slide. So we'll start the presentation with a little bit of background about the current state of with regard to critical infrastructure security. Foreign and rogue nations, state actors, are actively targeting critical infrastructure in the United States, according to a White House report that was recently published involving the National Security Agency and the Department of Homeland Security Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, that's CISA. Importantly, only 35% of the respondents in this survey rated their organization's internet-connected operational technology, OT, as cyber readiness high. The DHS indicated there was strong evidence of cyber threats involving the use of email spear phishing attacks to infiltrate critical infrastructure networks through these OT assets. Additionally, there are persistent efforts to conduct ransomware attacks on critical infrastructure on an ongoing basis. So it's very important. This is front and center. I know we hear about it every day, but we're going to get a little bit more into some examples of what's happening and just some information that has just come out today here in a second. So what do we see as the top cyber threats in 2020? It's like the DHS just mentioned: phishing, spear phishing, protecting remote worker endpoint with appropriate security, cloud jacking. If you're not familiar with that, you probably have read about it at AWS in misconfigured buckets or misconfigured security for cloud applications, and basically just the hacking or foray into that by a foreign actor, IoT device management, and of course, ransomware. So just to go over that quickly. This is a quote that was published this morning in a security publication that we follow. I'm just going to read it for you. At a time when the world is united in wanting to end the pandemic, anxiously awaiting the development of a safe and effective vaccine for COVID-19, it's essential for world leaders to unite around the security of our healthcare institutions and enforce the law against cyber attacks targeting those who endeavor to help us all. Right? So this is in relation to a larger prediction of what's happening. We have all the articles and sources for the quotes and information you'll see today that we can share with you all. But this was produced by this gentleman at Microsoft, who is the Customer Security and Trust Corporate Vice President, and it's in reaction to foreign state actors attempting to hack the likes of Pfizer and other biotech companies to disrupt, at this very vulnerable time, a vaccine production or vaccine discovery, if you will. So this is, time is of the essence, and this is an attack at times when you're most vulnerable, and we've seen that repeatedly throughout this year, ourselves as a security-facing business. To shed a little bit more color, I'm sure you've all heard about the NotPetya attacks that occurred in 2017, just a few years ago, which inadvertently hit several critical infrastructure companies in a massive way. NotPetya is the most successful cyber attack in history and was initiated by way of compromising an auditing software that was hosted out of the Ukraine. It was a Ukrainian accounting software, and some foreign actors infiltrated that, and by way of doing that, backdoored themselves into these two companies, for example. The Maersk attack, that's a shipping giant attack, is important as a case study because of the ransomware, disaster recovery, and peer-to-peer communications, right? So in essence, this story is well documented. They had massive downtime. They had 45,000 PCs that were wiped by this virus, over 4,000 servers. These guys were spread across every continent on the globe. They have massive IT offices in the UK that oversee all of these offices around the world. Again, they're an international shipping company for those who aren't familiar. They claimed that they had about 300 million in damages, but they had weeks of downtime, right? And we tell this story within the context of peer-to-peer and disaster recovery, like I mentioned, because the only way that Maersk was able to recover was because their North African offices were offline due to a power outage during the times of these attacks. So it's pointing to they were segregated from the rest of the network that was being overwhelmed by this virus only because the internet and power was out, right? So I'm saying that because it's important to note the power of network segmentation, right? So that's Maersk. Merck & Co., the pharmaceutical giant that we're all familiar with, it's important for a number of reasons. In situations like these where insurance claims are made, Merck claimed $1.3 billion in damages. You can see they had 7,500 servers and 30,000 workstations, even a larger capacity than what happened to Maersk, the shipping company. But within this, if you look at it from a case study, within this, their cyber insurance claims were being refuted because the insurance companies were claiming this was an act of war, which was not exactly as covered or at least delineated under their insurance policy. So then they have to go to court and battle this, and in the meantime, they're suffering weeks of downtime and lost work and reputational damage, et cetera, et cetera. So with both of these cases, communication is extremely important during this time. But what I'm really just trying to paint the picture of is that even though you might have insurance, you're not necessarily going to get your claims answered. There's other instances like HIPAA and compliances that can inflict their own monetary damages on top of everything that's happened. And we know this because we've been privy to attacks and restorations at every point across the spectrum, and have even interacted with hackers in real time during ransomware attacks. And I'll tell you that besides the reputational damages businesses incur, the speed at which the destruction rips through an organization is astounding. So like I said, the Maersk example, they were only protected because their power, the internet was out in the North African office. It happens that fast, right? So they're offline, they were safe, right? But the real takeaway here is that the preparedness is the number one most overlooked aspect we see today when it comes to cybersecurity vulnerabilities and the damage that can be inflicted upon our critical infrastructure in a matter of hours. So it's really all about being prepared. I'm sure we're all familiar with this image, looking at about 20 coworkers on a daily basis on a shared screen. In fact, right now there's about 500 participants on this webinar right now. According to a recent Gallup poll, 25% of all Americans are working remotely and are working more days remotely than ever before, posing higher risk to the organizations for which they work. This is typical of today's office space. This is simply a Zoom call or a webinar. Some technology companies like Twitter and Square are now recommending permanent work from home policies. And according to Gartner, a recent survey shows that the majority of CFOs expect some employees to work from home permanently. And because 94% of malware and ransomware is delivered via email, and over 80% of attacks come by way of phishing, remote connectivity is the new weakest link in our post or current COVID world. So this is something very important that's affecting all of us right now. So how secure are your communications? Now we're really going to get into the peer-to-peer component of which this topic, this webinar is based. So most secure emails like Proton Mail or encrypted email and Office 365, peer communication offerings like Signal, they include similar but only good functionality and security. And they only reduce a small portion of an enterprise's overall threat vector. Okay, so these platforms work well for personal communications, for example, in small groups, for you and your friends, but really fail when it comes to meeting the high demands of the enterprise. Yes, they include best practices like two-factor authentication, encryption, secure server hosting, which can actually mean a myriad of different things, antivirus, spam filtering, phishing reporting, ephemeral messaging, hidden IP addresses, et cetera, et cetera. These are all great components of peer-to-peer communication or secure communication. But again, they really only touch on one part of an enterprise's secure communication needs. So our vast experience has taught us that if you want better results, you have to do things differently. This can be difficult because organizations are loath to implement, learn, and support new technologies. If for no other reason, employees provide a lot of pushback. Trust us, we know. We deal with enterprise clients on a daily basis, and the division between IT and employees is vast, and although IT is greatly appreciated, they're not always wanted. So we're in that boat. We fully understand it. The solution needs to incorporate the aforementioned best practices, but the reason why these communication modalities don't pass muster on their own is because of the lack of scalability and the limited amount of integrated features which enterprises require to collaborate and conduct business from any number of locations by any number of employees on a daily basis, especially in today's COVID home working world, which appears to be more and more permanent according to the things that I'm showing you and what we're seeing. So this is what we really want you to understand. And that is, although there are great technologies available today with regard to peer-to-peer communication with good security, when you factor in the perhaps more important weight of collaboration between coworkers, they're nearly mutually exclusive when it comes to the needs of the enterprise organization, meaning they don't readily coexist. Okay. So what is peer-to-peer communications? Peer-to-peer communication is exactly as it sounds. Direct communications between two parties. But as you can see from the image above, peer-to-peer communications can be looked at in a number of different ways, which include an infinite number of different modalities for utilizing the peer connection in today's enterprise. importantly, not simply for communicating. Okay, it's commonly looked at as a tool to communicate, but the picture I'm really trying to paint is that this is one sliver of a big picture of how an organization works. We know how organizations work. We know it takes many different types of people, many different verticals within that, many different hierarchies within that to communicate and to have the end product, the end productivity meet goals, right? So it's not just for communicating. It's a great tool. That's why I'm putting it in the framework of it's good for small groups. I use them personally for different things with my family and things of that nature. But for example, just because two people can communicate securely by connecting through an encrypted tunnel, like a VPN, that does not mean that the other components of that communication, like the requisite file sharing, are best utilized amongst other required participants within the enterprise. For example, if a small group is using secure chat to communicate about a project, but also require secure file sharing, while some members of the chat group should not have write access, read-write access to the files, which need to be shared and accessed securely, this can pose a problem for this small group to collaborate and produce effectively. So this level of security and collaboration typically requires the use of several disparate technology services along with IT administration management for the correct permission access to the files and applications required. For this reason, the challenge becomes how to provide the best of both worlds, those being security and collaboration, right? And now if you look at the diagram here, I'll just go over quickly. Figure 1A shows encrypted peer-to-peer going through a service provider where the data, when it hits the service provider, for example, Verizon, the data is unencrypted. I know Snapchat does this. They unencrypt, sits on their files, they kept indefinitely, and then it's encrypted when it's sent out. So that's great encryption, but there's still a gap in the middle where your data is exposed, right? Figure 1B shows encryption from peer through the service provider to the other peer. This is better because the service provider is not able to see, scan, or share your data because it's encrypted. An example of this is Signal, the secure chat platform. And the third is end-to-end encryption with no service provider. Now that may sound difficult. How could this possibly happen without a service provider? But it is possible in today's world, and this is something that we do on a regular basis. The solution. So first I'll explain some of the cryptic sounding items on this list. And in order to minimize and reduce your attack vector, zero trust and authentication are critical, right? So the phrase goes, never trust, always verify. So what that means is that you shouldn't rely on the security of an application or the adherence by a person to the security, like encrypted email, but instead authenticate each time a connection is made. Now, there are very few peer applications that do this, but this step is of critical importance, right? So if you're not authenticating, there could be many, many gaps in even a peer-to-peer connection profile. So again, we can answer questions specifically at the end, but I just want to lay out some of the high points here. Micro-segmentation, also can be known as segmented networking, networking as a service. This is a highly scalable software-based networking. Software only. This does not require hardware, or it does. Secure non-public domains, private clouds, and data stewardship. That means someone that you're enlisting, possibly through a business associate agreement, to oversee your data at some level. That does not mean they have to see it in its entirety or even at all, but possibly be there to support you, right? So these are the components that we feel are critical to any peer or secure communication platform or architecture. All right, so we'll look a little further into the challenges of expanding peer-to-peer communications to include not only communications like email, chat, voice, but to also incorporate peer connectivity to shared file systems like databases or even remote cloud applications. So this is what I was talking about earlier when I was saying it's your attack vector is your entire organization. And when you start to cut off slivers, peer-to-peer will start to cover part of that. And now secure networking will start to cover another part of that. But you get to have them become segmented and isolated and possibly not interoperable, inhibiting collaboration, right? So it's very important to know that this is achievable without the use of multiple security tools like firewalls, VLANs, certificates, or siloed email or chat platforms like we've discussed. The key is the integration of security tools and private networks to achieve harmony between security and utility. Okay. Importantly, the final solution should contain those pertinent items listed on the screen here, but also be scalable, manageable, and adaptable to the enterprise's information security policy. So achieving interoperability and zero trust, right? This is the challenge, right? So I'll give you an example of a client for whom we've implemented an enterprise security solution that manages not just their secure peer-to-peer communications, but multiple secure networks, several secure hosted applications and databases, who has unlimited scalability and connects hundreds of employees all interacting with one another on the secure private networks while also accounting for their individual predetermined applications and data permission levels. The example of which I'm speaking is a large healthcare organization who sits at the hub of thousands of physicians, dozens of hospitals and specialty practices, and some of the largest insurance companies in the world. Fortunately, much of the heavy lifting on the security side is handled by the application we incorporate to solve this problem. By deploying a secure domain architecture, participants are able to interact with other permission peers in any number of secure domains, so other secure private networks, while still only maintaining a preset level of access to databases or cloud-hosted applications within their security profile and also within their secure domain. So you see that we're expanding from simply secure peer-to-peer connectivity, the security and the importance of that we've shown, but now we're expanding it to include the different profiles of the hierarchies of permissions that those employees have, and also incorporating applications and data for which they can access securely through those same networks, right? So by looking at the challenge from a macro approach, we were able to first identify the key company assets, right? Namely their patient databases and hosted auditing applications. We were able to ideally segregate those assets to secure domains in the cloud, and then look at the user security profiles who required varying levels of access to those applications, as well as the other peers within and outside the organization, and how those peers should be able to communicate amongst themselves and the data, right? Critical. Not just communicating, interoperability of communication and data in a collaborative sense, but in a secure peer world, right? So because every business is different, and because the process of implementing peer-to-peer security protocols, it all begins with the understanding the enterprise's security information policy. If there's not a policy in place, the first step is a security risk assessment. This will immediately identify the enterprise communication and productivity current risks, and is the first step in outlining the security objectives for the organization in their profile. So not until a security policy is agreed upon should an architecture be designed and a secure peer-to-peer solution be implemented around those requirements. So I know this is a lot of information in a short amount of time. I really appreciate your time, appreciate being here, and I'd like you to take away, you should now remember that there are good peer-to-peer communication tools, but they largely lack the key facets of authentication and collaboration. And those are the keys that we see time and time again that push organizations away from secure peer-to-peer, because alone they offer little utility, right? So we're happy to answer questions at the end. Like I said, we have our technical engineer, Robert, on with us, and I believe Jaron is up next. So thank you again for your time, everybody. So I think, Teresa, you're taking back over?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so April, would you like to introduce Mr. Martin?
She's saying she's muted by the organizer.
Oh, bad, Risa. Apologies. Try it now, April.
I was talking to my cell phone over there. All right, back on track. All right, so we'll do Q&A at the end of this. Continue submitting your questions in the chat, and we'll read them off at the end and get Brian and his team to respond. So next up is Jaron Martin with FBI. He's a computer scientist there. Jaron joined the FBI as a computer scientist in 2013 and is responsible for assisting the investigative team understand and exploit the technical details that are increasingly important in a wide variety of investigations. Jaron has assisted with numerous cases ranging from cyber intrusions, encrypted communications, bank robberies, fraud, corruption, violent crimes, and others. In addition to assisting with investigations, Jaron has developed training curriculum for newly hired computer scientists, worked on development projects to create internal FBI tools, and currently serves as the FBI CS Regional Coordinator for the South Central region. Jaron, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. Can you hear me? Perfect. Thanks, April. As she said, my name is Jaron Martin. I'm a field computer scientist with the FBI New Orleans office. Basically what that means is we're responsible for assisting case agents with technical components of investigations. That could be something like a cyber intrusion, and most field computer scientists are technically assigned to cyber squads. But most, if not all, investigations touch computers at this point, right? So most of the digital evidence is going to be processed by either that office or that RCFL's computer analysis response team, CART team. But the more technical or one-off things that come through during an investigation, that's where the field computer scientists get involved. So we end up getting pulled into a lot of different types of cases. But today I was asked to talk about the importance of these encrypted peer-to-peer communications before, during, and after a cyber attack. So it's really easy to think, you know, these scenarios I'm hearing, they're the worst case scenario, or that's never going to happen to me. But in any disaster recovery situation, whether it's a computer intrusion, even just network failure, server issues, any kind of remediation you need is going to require some kind of business continuity and secure, efficient communications, right? How would your organization or even just your business unit communicate with your corporate network, including your email, instant messaging, most phones at this point are VoIP phones, IP phones? If all of that went offline for a period of time, what would you do? What if you couldn't look up somebody's cell phone number in your corporate directory? Even if the network's still up, if your email server or even individual email accounts are compromised and maybe a business email compromised, communicating about your incident response using those compromised means of communication is, you know, of course, a bad idea. So in the event of a cyber attack, would you be comfortable taking those communication systems offline if you needed to remediate? Are you ready for, you know, do you have the communication plans in place for that to take place? So Brian talked about quite a few critical infrastructure companies that found themselves in these similar types of situations. You know, thousands of servers, tens of thousands of PCs being wiped, resulting in weeks of downtime, right? But another obvious example of this that people are aware of that got a lot of media coverage is the intrusion back in 2014 of the large media and video game company, which you can probably figure out. But full disclosure, had nothing to do with the investigation itself. This is all just from open source reporting. But according to a number of open source articles, after the initial intrusion and after massive amounts of data exfiltration, the attackers used data wiping tools to essentially wipe out their entire corporate network infrastructure. So say you come into work and all of your servers, workstations, and laptops are completely wiped, right? Rebuilding that infrastructure from scratch is hard enough. But if you're also trying to preserve evidence for law enforcement and investigate who did it and figure out how they did it so that you can make sure that they don't get in again as soon as your network is back online, all while all of your methods of communication existed on that network that no longer exists. So articles made reference to employees having to use paper and whiteboards just to do their jobs. And while whiteboards are great sometimes, it definitely doesn't replace your, network. So basically, what can we learn from this, right? You're all members of Infragard, so probably preaching to the choir, but it's so important to have some kind of disaster or recovery or business continuity plan in place. That it's got to include secure, efficient, and some kind of available alternate way to communicate with people inside and outside your company, i.e. law enforcement, right? So having that plan for secure, independent, robust communication platform that doesn't depend on the same corporate infrastructure that your traditional email or messaging or file sharing solution is just so important. And if you don't want to wait until you're already struggling with an intrusion or even just network infrastructure issues to figure out how are you going to communicate? You don't want to be the company that's trying to figure out how to get signal running on everyone's phones while you can't talk to them or send them emails. So organizations like Infragard are a really good way to talk with people at similar companies and try to figure out what works for them, what doesn't work. So if I can stress anything, it's just be prepared ahead of time, right? It's so important to have this communication platform ready to go in the event that something happens. So be ready with a plan so you're not stranded. In a way, you have a way to stay in touch during an incident where communication is completely crucial. So Brian did a good job of explaining the problem. I don't really have too much else to add. So I'm going to turn you back over to April.
All right. Thanks, Darren. Much appreciated. I think at this time we're going to move on to Q&A. Teresa, you want to spin up the questions?
Yes, so I have started assigning questions. So I have been assigning them. So Brian, can you see those questions that I've assigned to you?
Let me see. Yeah, I see questions. Okay, so are these all directed to me if I open my questions here? Yeah.
That should be all the ones that I assigned to you, and I'm going through some more, and I'm going to be issuing some to Jaren as well.
Okay, so the first one that I see is from Eric Dreyer. So he says, really trying to educate small businesses on the need to properly protect themselves via levels of security and employee training. Small business owners don't think they will get targeted, but they are the ones who are. Any tips? You're absolutely right. It's the hacker's world is all about the easiest hanging fruit, right? The low hanging fruit. How do they get it? The difficulty with small businesses is that they don't necessarily have the budget or the internal staff to take themselves to the position where they need to be. And it's difficult. We've dealt with a lot of physicians' practices, small businesses across the boards from a single school, a private school, a church, or some type of garage, a mechanic's office, or anything. Hundreds of different of businesses, and yeah, they're all big targets. If you're looking for the best things to do, like I said in my presentation, it really comes down to doing an assessment on the risk of that specific organization. Every organization is different, right? Yeah, sure, we all have similar needs, but those needs are often unique. At a high level, everyone needs antivirus, good spam filtering, phishing. I recommend an EDR application, endpoint detection and response, which is a next level, next generation antivirus. It's only a little bit more than the current antivirus. Obviously, it's more than the free Microsoft one, which I do recommend. But that, along with a data backup disaster recovery program, if you can run that internally, great. If you can't, outsource it to a managed service company, and a good firewall that can protect your perimeter. There's obviously dozens of other scenarios that we could paint together, but if I was going to say three, I'd say next generation antivirus, which is an EDR program, some type of disaster recovery backup, managed solution with support where you can fail over to the cloud, and a good firewall. So I hope that answers your question. This is from John Baviard. Explain why ransom payments are ineffective. How ransom payments are ineffective. Also, where does user awareness training enter as a proactive means to minimize attacks? Well, ransom payments can be ineffective because the individuals hacking and holding your data for ransom, they don't have to do anything. They don't have to comply. Terrorists don't have to comply, right? So although most ransomware incidents, if paid, do get their data back, there is absolutely no guarantee. But what happens when you're paying this ransom to get your data back? First of all, it could cost millions of dollars, as we've seen municipalities get hit around the country and have to pay these things because in some ways they don't have the budget to protect themselves, and that's why they're being targeted. But it encourages more of the ransom. So they picked their mark, they hit their mark, they got paid. What are they going to do? Sit back and relax? No, they're going to go do it again, right? So it's almost like we don't deal with terrorists. So the best way to alleviate that or to remove that risk is with those three items that I mentioned in the previous answer. And the number one way, in our opinion, is to have a good disaster recovery service that allows your data to be backed up to a cloud-hosted application off-site and is supported by a third-party data steward or a business associate. And that means that even if your data is fully encrypted in your office or your organization or whatever you might be running, it doesn't matter as much because you have an exact replica that has the ability to fail over into an active state in the cloud within your required guidelines to operate your business. So that's what I would say to answer those questions. The next question from Aaron Jones. Are you using radio-based communications to avoid a service provider? That's a good question. The application that we incorporate for our secure communications is it can run on Wi-Fi, it can run on telecommunications, and it can run on direct internet. It runs off of any device on all major operating systems. So you have a lot of diversity when it comes to the redundancy of the connectivity, the availability of the data across multi-platforms, and the accessibility because you can have it on your mobile, you can have it on your desktop. And one thing we didn't really get into, which Jaron mentioned, is the hosting of that service can be done at the location of your choice, right? So when you start to look at it that way, maybe you have your Office 365 hosted in-house, or your Exchange server hosted in-house, or whatever, and they're compromised. You could have another system hosted elsewhere. And if you have the diversity of being able to connect through a network connection or Wi-Fi or cellular, now you're giving yourself the redundancy that you're going to stay in communication with your team or your support who might be outside of you. Next question from Eric. Have you evaluated the new EDE Enterprise and latest Zoom client base on its strength compared to Signal. We have not. I know they made some rapid improvements during COVID because they were under criticism, but ostensibly, at least my opinion was, this was something that they threw together quickly to alleviate some of the heat they're getting in the press. But other than that high level, I don't really know. I'm sure at this point they've done something, but again, I don't think that this data is not sitting on Zoom servers, it's not accessible by Zoom, et cetera, et cetera. So I would expect that it's fully accessible, scannable, readable, shareable, but we don't know that much about Zoom's infrastructure. So I can't directly comment, only speculate. The next question, what would be effective protection for Zoom or other video conference methods? Also, is a VPN a reasonable source when they are offshore? So your first question, yes, there are effective secure communications and collaboration tools. In fact, the application that we manage has recently, in response to COVID, has recently launched a collaboration video conferencing tool within these secure private networks and applications. So it's awesome, and it works great. So that is an alternative. Now, the only drawback is that only people who are invited and have access to these secure networks can be part of it. So we couldn't do something like this with people sharing the link and deciding to come in, right? You all have to be permissioned. But therein lies the rub of zero trust and open networking, right? So that's where these risk assessments and these types of analysis come into play before you start to implement something, right? But yes, there are great solutions like you're asking. Is a VPN reasonable source when they're offshore? Sure. A VPN simply means it's a tunnel between 2 points with the data encrypted inside. So as long as the VPN does what it says, it doesn't matter if it's offshore or not. Mostly people use offshore to mask applications they're trying to access in China, for example, that might be blacklisted. But sure. So the last couple questions. Since Microsoft Teams is fully contained in different Office 365 services, SharePoint, Exchange, Teams, would you consider it a secure peer-to-peer communication solution for both live communication and other types of collaboration, such as sharing files? Well, it's certainly a good collaboration tool. It is not domiciled in the most secure way that we would recommend. So I wouldn't say that it's peer-to-peer. I'd say it's a hosted collaboration tool with some decent security features. So it's, like I try to paint in the presentation, you sometimes have to choose from security to utility. And it's really a balance of those two factors that will lead to the organization's productivity and output, right? So it's really organization specific on their security risk profiles that we also spoke about. So that I would first always consider your security risk profile through an assessment, and then decide, hey, is Teams good enough for us? Are we comfortable with this? Are we willing to take this X amount of risk? Or do we need to tighten things down and implement something new, right? Looks like the last question from Jeff. Apple has patched it. Just how do you protect against this, since I have users that have iPhone, etc.? I'm not quite sure what you're asking. Apple has patched it. How do you protect against this? I'm not quite sure the question of what's been patched. If you're just generally talking about patches, patch always, continually, automatic patches. And if you can't do it, stay on top of it, have a third party do it for you. So I'm not sure if that's the exact answer, but I didn't quite understand the question. So that's all the questions I see.
I've got a few showing up on my end. So one of them says, with the growth of work at home, what is your opinion of risk related to portable apps or shadow apps with mini networks? So I think what they're referring to is like apps that were not, say, controlled or managed by your IT within your organization. So installing things out of band So like from our perspective here at the FBI, that's, you know, most of the computers are very locked down, right? You're restricted into what things can be installed. You can't use any like, third-party file sharing websites, that sort of thing, at least for your normal day-to-day work. And that's just because, but it's based on your organization's what is important to your organization and what kind of data are you trying to protect, and are you more worried about availability, or is it the confidentiality of the data that's important? So, you know, at least from our perspective, we're not allowed to use any kind of like Dropbox style, you know, messaging that's not, or apps, file transfer things that are not approved directly for our use for that reason, because, you know, we have data that, you know, subpoena returns and things that just can't get out, can't get to the public. So that's, but it's really important for the organization in that sense to have enterprise solutions that actually do facilitate you doing your job efficiently. So you need a way to transfer large files. You need the apps that you need to do your job. It just needs to be managed at a central level. So the next question is, what do we do when people are pretending to be our ISP and rewiring the whole building? That is, yeah, a very large, that would be a real problem. And it comes back to, that's access control, right? Is verifying that the people who are coming into your space are who they say they are. And if someone shows up claiming to be your ISP and you're not expecting them, they shouldn't be allowed in, period. You should verify that before they get access. But let's see. I think this may be related to the question you got earlier. Can one of the presenters elaborate on an exploit that was found by security researcher Ian Beer, who works at Google's Project Zero team? It involves a vulnerability in AWDL, Apple's protocol that allows iPhones, Macs, and other devices to create peer-to-peer mesh networks, which enable functions such as AirDrop and AirPlay. So I don't know a lot about that exploit directly, but that was the one that you could cause an iPhone to reboot itself and then gain basically uncontrolled access to the device after it reboots. But it was patched before it was ever seen in the wild, I guess. So I can't say much about it besides it's stressing that you maintain security patches and how important it is to install those patches when they come out, because they do contain real fixes for real problems. Even if the problems were patched before they come out, if you don't patch, then someone could definitely exploit those vulnerabilities. Let's see. With TLS encryption via email, the concern, of course, is if that actor has already infiltrated the recipient company's email. What are the recommendations on exchanging sensitive data back to the encryption? In other words, if there are any specific recommended solutions in exchanging large sensitive files, Dropbox, SFTP, etc. So I guess the difference is it's the point the person receiving to be able to access the decrypted data, right? So if they're compromised, there's not a lot you can do, but what for things that need to be secure to a person using, you know, PGP keys to encrypt those files for transmitting them so that you know that the only person with that key can decrypt them on the other end, even if the email itself is compromised, or some other, you know, password protected file is really the best way that I can think of to do that. What are the top 3 or 5 security issues you see with Office 365 and Teams? I mean, the most thing when it comes to like Office 365 is just ensuring that the devices people are using to connect to your corporate data, are those devices protected by your corporate IT policy, or are people accessing these systems using personal devices and that sort of thing, and is that something that your company is comfortable with and that sort of thing? But I'm not sure what else to talk to about that. Sorry, these things are cutting off a little bit. Let's see. In your experience, is there a particular alternative communications product you'd recommend in the event of an incident or taking down comms? Or have you mostly seen organizations simply move to using personal devices to communicate? So unfortunately, as the FBI, we can't really recommend any kind of commercial products or anything like that. So that may be a better question for someone else to answer. But reverting to personal devices is like, that's kind of your last ditch effort, right? You don't want to have to do that, and figuring out a way to, like, that comes back to efficient communication, right? There needs to be a system in place in advance. And if you don't have that, you're going to revert to either third-party apps like people, Signal, WhatsApp, that sort of thing, to try to do these kind of communications. And that's just not a good way to go, especially for kind of a core environment. It just doesn't have the features that you need to really communicate. Let's see, and these are, I think, duplicates. So I guess that's all the questions I have. I don't know if Brian has any more input on those questions or not, but.
Yeah, sure, Jared. I'll add just a couple points. So thanks. With regard to teams, one of the things that we've seen is really more around like guests being added to a video chat, and then inadvertently getting access to files that are shared within teams. There are ways to disable this, but again, it's when we're talking about the secure networks, micro-segmentation, secure domains, things of that nature. When you architect it from a risk profile first, with specifically this technology that I've been speaking about, alluding to, you're able to eliminate that type of scenario. Now, like I said, you can eliminate that within teams as well, but it's a protocol first approach and not second. So, and with regard to the application, yes, there is one that we recommend, like he mentioned, Signal. That's great. I use it for personal stuff. I'm overseas. I use different things, just to not have to pay long distance or whatnot. But the application that we use, and if you visit our website, you can learn more about it. But it's called Gabriel, and it's owned by a company called Vernetics. It's just a publicly traded company. They actually license the technology to Apple, Microsoft, et cetera, and Asgard is the only licensor of the technology for sales in North America and for support. So when we implement this technology along with our private cloud, we're able to create not only secure peer-to-peer, email, chat, voice, video conferencing, file sharing, file storage in the cloud, unique hosting scenarios, but we're able to actually start to implement some of these key hosted assets into private networks, and then giving permissions to networks to speak to each other. So it sounds complex, but the application is once architected correctly is simple to scale and efficient to manage. So not here to plug our service, but since someone's asking, elaborate on it.
Okay, I have another question here. Is there a standard cyber risk assessment template? I think, Brian, you talked about having an assessment done. Is there some type of standard template that could be used for a facility or a business to assess their communications?
Oh, sure, yeah. So the different compliances, there's like NERC and FISMA, PCI, HIPAA. For example, HIPAA, you can go to the HHS website and actually download a client tool, and it actually walks you through a HIPAA compliance, which is a type of a security risk assessment. There's ISO compliance, which a lot of just general businesses that don't face other compliances must comply with. We don't use a template for ISO, but I'm sure you could probably find one and follow that best practices, or you could engage with a company who has security consulting expertise to do it with you or for you.
Okay, thanks. I don't have any more questions up for y'all. If not, I'm going to summarize and close out. Okay. All right, so, just a couple of things that I caught on to today. Just trying to reiterate, as Sharon said earlier, Now's the time, if you haven't already, to begin thinking about peer-to-peer communications and what you're going to do if you are attacked by a cyber or a hurricane. It could be anything, right? What is your alternate communications plan? What you don't want to do from a cyber perspective is be in the middle of a cyber event and have to determine how you're going to communicate to the rest of your business that you are under attack, and they shouldn't click on certain links, or they shouldn't do anything to further damage what's already been done. So just a good point to take forward in your disaster recovery plans. Start thinking about what that next communication type is for your agency. At this time, I think that's it. I'd like to thank all of our panels. Appreciate everything here, and say our sponsors, Secure Nation and Checkpoint. And then I'm going to do my Infragard plug here. If you're not an Infragard member already and you would like more information or would like to become one, please email Teresa, Lester, and myself. Go to our Infragard Louisiana website and register. And again, as John stated, Infragard's a good way to share information and learn about what the best encrypted peer-to-peer communications is best for your agency. Thank you all.